before we get into the CIA and music festivals, just address for me this general question. How dangerous is the CIA to personal liberty?
They're tremendously dangerous. And, it's helpful to think of the CIA as being part of this diplomacy, defense, intelligence apparatus. A lot of times you can sort of think of many of the operations of the Department of Defense and the Department of State as being inextricably woven with the Central Intelligence Agency, because it sort of acts as the cloak and dagger arm of those two pillars of our defense and diplomacy subject. So it's really one conjoined apparatus. And the CIA is very unique because it has a license to lie. It was created under the 1947 National Security Act specifically to do the sort of dark arts, cloak and dagger stuff that the State Department wanted to do, but couldn't get busted doing. And so they wanted this plausibly deniable agency to do the dirty work that would be an international fiasco if the government got caught doing.
Is it as bad as the old KGB?
In many ways, it's hard to use a word like worse there, given some of the history of the Soviet Union. But the technological prowess that's available today to the Central Intelligence Agency, and the hubris, I think, that set in after the Cold War was won, makes it unquestionably at least a rival in terms of the tier rankings of malevolent forces in intelligence history.
Does the CIA, or do agents, employees, officers, analysts, I know there are different levels of CIA workers, do they acknowledge, at least internally and within the walls of their headquarters at Langley, that they kill people?
Yeah, well, I mean, the CIA is formally in charge of our drone program. This happened during the global war on terror, when there was the apportioning of military capacities between the DoD and the CIA, and the drone program was effectively handed over to the Central Intelligence Agency. That's remote control assassination, with a bad history of targeting weddings and other type of events that cause international scandal. But even more perhaps insidious than outright killings and even assassinations. Assassinations were sort of banned after the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, after the CIA killed Lumumba and killed Allende and killed a bunch of world leaders and got busted doing it, essentially. Then they said, okay, all right, we're not going to assassinate world leaders again, but we're sort of going to kill everyone around them, or leaders of insurgency groups. But even more pernicious, perhaps, than the outright killing is the authorization for quote, organized political warfare. Right when the CIA was born in 1947, in 1948, George Kennan, who's one of the godfathers of the CIA, penned this memo called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare, where he basically said, listen, we just rigged 12 days ago. This is in 1948, right before this memo was penned. So 12 days ago, we just rigged this election in Italy. We worked with Sicilian mobsters. We worked with members of the church. We worked with this whole underground that was persecuted by Mussolini, who we had these partnerships with in order to establish a beachhead in Italy during World War II. We worked with them to rig the 1948 Italian election, because if the communists won in that case, then there might never be an election again in Italy. So we had to rig this one, but it turned out really well. So we're just going to keep doing it in Greece and then in France and Australia. I mean, this became a blueprint. And now we're sort of living in the shadow of total unchecked power for going on 80 years now.
For whom does the CIA work? Is it the President of the United States? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the Secretary of Defense? Or are they rogues? Are they totally on their own?
Well, technically they operate, they're part of the executive branch under the president, but they're really the underside of the State Department. The State Department and the CIA have been kissing cousins, so to speak, since the day the CIA was created. You had Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles serving as the CIA chief and the Secretary of State, essentially brothers running both of those. That continues to this day under the Trump administration. You may recall Mike Pompeo was the director of the CIA, and then his next job was the Secretary of State. What you essentially have are kind of two towers of our global empire management, one being overt diplomacy, the State Department, the other being covert diplomacy or covert action, that being the Central Intelligence Agency. And both of those overt and covert sides of our diplomacy have to be synchronized in order to have a cohesive plan of action in a country or region whose
Got it.
elections we want to. Yeah. So
Our former CIA agents and officers who come on this show have almost uniformly bemoaned the fact that Bill Burns, the current director of the CIA, is a member of the president's cabinet. Is there some substance there, or is it just symbolic?
I'm not sure about that. Bill Burns has, he came directly from the Carnegie Endowment. He was for 7 years, he was the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a 7-decade history of serving as a CIA conduit. He was obviously a major State Department official before that. It's hard for me to penetrate the cabinet role versus a not in terms of its significance, but certainly one of the big knocks that the foreign policy establishment had against Trump was that he through his lack of promotion of the democracy promotion programs and these sort of State Department dirty tricks programs, they wanted a more fully imbued CIA and State Department dirty tricks capacity, like what had existed for many decades prior to that. Trump was obviously the first president in something like 40 years not to declare a new war. He also put the kibosh on a number of initiatives ranging from Syria to Afghanistan to operations in Ukraine. So the elevation of the role of the Central Intelligence Agency under Biden would be no surprise to me.
One of the things that you have brought to our attention when we communicated earlier this week was the role of the CIA in art and music festivals. Now, when I first heard this, I smiled and I said, look, Mike's a smart guy, but this is really off the wall. Can this actually be happening? So give us a little bit of background on what the CIA does with art and music festivals. And are we talking about art and music festivals in the U.S. or outside the U.S.? Because outside. you and I have both read the CIA charter, and it pretty clearly prohibits them from doing anything in the U.S., even though we know they do. So give us a big picture, and then we'll run some clips from these music festivals.
Sure. And a quick note on that, the Church Committee hearings in 1975 and 1976 had their basis in part on the fact that the CIA had actually gone against that charter with things like Operation Chaos and their infiltration of left-wing student groups who were anti-Vietnam War. They were essentially paying left-wing student publications on college campuses in order to sway hearts and minds against the sort of far left, which at the time was anti-war. And when they got caught doing that, that of course led to these sort of left-wing oriented Church Committee hearings to say never again will you break this charter. But returning to arts and music, what we had in 1948 with the UN Declaration on Human Rights was this idea that you could no longer conquer territory by force. It's no longer accepted by international law that you could just roll into a country with tanks. You had to have some sort of democratic predicate. The hearts and minds had to sort of ratify the support for the governance structure in a particular country. And the modality of taking over a country effectively in order to exploit its resources, extract its gas or its minerals, in order to have it serve as a basically proxy state for our military bases, you had to have the hearts and minds of the citizenry at least ratify that government in support of U.S. policy. And so everything shifted to organized political warfare, again, returning to that George Kennan concept from 1948, the year that the UN Declaration on Human Rights was ratified. And so very quickly out the gate during the Eisenhower administration, there became this idea that organized political warfare means everything is essentially an instrument of statecraft, and very quickly arts and music became co-opted. In 1952, for example, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was constructed by the Central Intelligence Agency to serve as a cutout for dominating arts and culture at a time when the U.S. had not yet established hegemony in that respect. There were many Russian composers like Shostakovich who were sort of said to be best in class in things like classical music. And so the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was set up and funded by the CIA, flew the Boston Symphony Orchestra over to Paris for concerts in 1952. And then they set up strings of concerts in Rome in 1954, all throughout the 1950s and 60s, actually all through the 70s as well, culminating in not just concerts in France and in Italy, but also these large outdoor music concerts in West Germany and in Berlin in 1976 to gin up protest sentiment in order to tear down the wall and reunify Germany as part of the Euro-Atlantic axis. Now, this goes all the way back even before the Congress for Cultural Freedom. In the 1940s, the State Department began working with jazz musicians. It was called jazz diplomacy at the time. And this was a way of trying to get African nations who were newly sovereign after World War II to not see America as being this sort of, white ethno state, to sort of tamp down on accusations of colonialism and racism. And they recruited assets like Louis Armstrong and many other jazz musicians who are household names. This is all well documented. It's on the State Department's website, actually. But music as an instrument of statecraft has existed essentially since the moment World War II ended. You can make an argument it was rolled up in the Office of War Information during World War II itself, but it extends to this day. Just 2 months ago, Tony Blinken announced a brand new music diplomacy initiative at the State Department for the State Department to work worldwide with musicians in order to stymie authoritarianism. This is not a charity mission. In fact, just 2 years ago,
let me just stop you. This is news and didn't seem that you're breaking now. Didn't seem to appear anywhere. What is Tony Blinken doing, and what does he hope to achieve with this? Tony Blinken being the Secretary of State.
Right. So this is a brand new music diplomacy initiative. It broke about two months ago. I covered it quite extensively, but I think the news media did not quite pick up on the significance of this. Unless you enjoy reading state.gov, tell-alls, you don't really get into the minutia, I think, for a lot of folks on how these operations work. But a great example of it was just 2 years ago when there was the revolution in Cuba, organized by the San Isidro movement, an arts collective in Cuba, a rap group in Cuba that was funded and incubated by the National Endowment for Democracy, who is perhaps to this day the world's most premier CIA cutout. Even the Washington Post in the 1990s acknowledged that the National Endowment for Democracy serves as a CIA cutout. Its founder says that we do overtly what the CIA.
Okay, let me just stop you for a minute. So CIA gets tax dollars and gives them to a Cuban rock group if it funnels it through the National Endowment for Humanities or the National Endowment for Democracy, whatever they want to call their front group. What is the CIA trying to accomplish by putting American laundered tax dollars into the pockets of Cuban rap musicians?
So there's two ways to topple a foreign government. The old style way was you bribe, you get a certain quorum of the military establishment to defect. And so you essentially have a military coup. But the other way that was developed primarily early after World War II is this technique called a color revolution, which is a people-powered revolution where you primarily rely on street muscle from young people and from student groups. And then you have trade union laborers, you have people from all across the society sort of do a collective walkout. That way the state can't marshal instruments of institutions within its own country in order to enforce the law. And then if they crack down on these protests, they're subject to enormous international sanctions and essentially lose their sovereign wealth funds held in the Federal Reserve or held in the US dollar. And so you have this technique of getting the young people, the youth and students to take to the streets in protest to shut down government buildings, to shut down the infrastructure and to destabilize the country from the inside until the president is ran out of power, as what was done to Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014. And so this relies, you need to get hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. That's the end goal. That's what the end stage of any color revolution looks like. And to do that, music is very powerful to that extent. So just one quick thing here on the Cuban group. They created this anthem called Patria y Vida, which was basically like blood and soil. which is this sort of nationalist anthem against the communist government there. And that song became the rallying cry for the concerts. To this day, I was just at Miami Art Week. They had exhibits on this song and its role in the protest movement. The CIA did the same thing with creating a song called Winds of Change by the Scorpions in the 1970s in an effort to try to galvanize German youths to reject the East Germany Soviet government. So this idea of having a theme song, of having culturally significant and popular figures that essentially create the kind of soundtrack of a protest and cuts across all the differences of the different groups. So they don't really care if whether one of the factions is pro-abortion or anti-abortion or pro-capitalist or pro-socialist. If they're all listening to the same music, they're all revering the same cultural figures, they all have a reason to be at the same party together. They all have a reason to take to the streets together.